It began with a takeoff that felt like a national prayer and ended in one of history's most maddening silences. May 8th of 1927, Paris is barely awake, but Le Bourget is already crackling with nerves, ambition, and that special kind of excitement that humans produce when they're about to watch someone attempt something that might be brilliant or fatal, or if everything is aligned, maybe both. Out on the field sits a white biplane called Les Oiseaux Blancs, or the white bird. It looks like less than a weapon, more like a promise. It is slim, beautiful. It is overloaded with fuel, and it's pointed west toward New York. Inside are two men who are already heroes, already famous, already bruised and scarred by the war and speed and luck, and somehow they're still hungry for more outrageous accomplishments. Charles Nungesser and François Coli are about to try something no one else has yet done. They're going to fly nonstop across the Atlantic from Paris to New York. No stop, no rescue ship waiting like some kindly aunt, and no radio. Just fuel, nerve, navigation, weather, and whatever mercy the sky and the ocean feel like extending toward them. And that's what makes this story so gripping. It's not simply about a disappearance, it's about timing, pride, and historical tragedy so exquisitely cruel that it feels unfair nearly a century later. Because if you know even a little about aviation history, you know another name is waiting just around the corner. Charles Lindbergh in the Spirit of St. Louis, from New York to Paris. He received a hero's welcome. History books still remember his name before they move on. But before Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic and became the face of the new age, France had its own pair of champions in the air, and for a brief and astonishing stretch of time, it looked as though they might win the race first. But then they vanished so completely that their final hours became a permanent argument. To feel the weight of that morning in Paris, you have to know who these men were. Charles was not the sort of person who enters a room quietly or lives a life that can be described without making several people nervous. Born in Paris in 1892, Charles loved sports, speed, competition, and danger with what appears to have been an almost impolite enthusiasm. As a young man, he ended up in South America, worked as an auto mechanic, raced professionally, and learned to fly on a friend's airplane. Already you can feel that this man was not built for modest antidotes. When the First World War broke out, he went back to France and then enlisted and quickly began building the kind of reputation that sounds more like a serialized adventure fiction than a military file. He first joined the cavalry, which already feels charmingly old fashioned for a man who would rather later become famous in the sky. During one patrol, he and several other soldiers captured a German patrol car after killing its occupants. This so impressed his superiors enough that they granted his request finally to transfer to aviation. Once he got in the air, Charles began collecting victories, medals, wounds, punishments, and legend at a pace that must have exhausted everyone around him, especially his superiors. He was decorated repeatedly. He shot down enemy aircraft. He flew missions he was not supposed to fly. He borrowed airplanes when he was convalescing. He returned and turned insubordination into something close to an aesthetic. He was house arrested more than once for flying without permission, which is one of those details that tells you everything and nothing all at once. And then there's the damage. By the end of the war, Charles' body had become a sort of medical horror anthology. Somehow he was still an attractive man, but he had skull fractures, brain contusions, multiple internal injuries, fractures of the jaw, shrapnel in the arm, knees that dislocated repeatedly, bullet wounds in the mouth and ear, dislocated clavicle, wrists, and ankle. He had missing teeth, atrophy of the leg, contusions too numerous to list, which is the kind of phrase that makes a doctor stop and stare at the wall for a while. He was often so injured that he had to be helped into his cockpit if he was going to fly, and yet he kept flying. If there is a more vivid example of a man refusing to interpret pain as a useful suggestion, I have not heard of it. Naturally, he also cultivated an image. Charles was handsome and reckless and decorated and popular and very aware that these qualities played well in Paris. He loved the nightlife and women and wine and speed. He occasionally turned up for morning patrol still dressed in his evening clothes from the night before, which is either wildly glamorous or deeply concerning depending on how much you value self-preservation. His airplane bore his personal insignia. It was a black heart containing a skull and crossbones, a coffin, and candles. It was macabre, theatrical, and absolutely impossible to forget. He was called the Knight of Death, which sounds dramatic until you realize he probably enjoyed being called that, maybe a little bit too much. François Coli, by contrast, was a different sort of man, and that difference is one reason that the pairing worked so well. François was born in Marseille in 1881 into a Corsican seafaring family. He had the instincts of a navigator long before navigation became a part of his life in the aviation world. He had been a merchant captain. He had a wife and daughters. When the First World War began, he offered himself first to the Navy, but then entered the Army, eventually becoming a captain before transferring to aviation after being judged unfit for infantry due to his wounds. He gained a reputation not as a flamboyant celebrity, but as a superb navigator and steady leader. That sort of competence is not as catchy on a poster, but it becomes rather important when your plan involves crossing an ocean with no radio and a cockpit open to the elements. François had also been dreaming about the transatlantic crossing for years. By the early 1920s, he was already making record-setting flights around the Mediterranean. He was experienced, methodical, and very well respected. In 1923, he began planning a nonstop transatlantic flight with wartime comrade Paul Tarascon. Then an accident destroyed the aircraft and badly injured Paul, who had to abandon the plan. This is where Charles entered the story in earnest. He had his own ideas about crossing the Atlantic and had reportedly told friends in America that his next trip there would be by air. Chief designer Pierre Lavoisier insisted that Charles not attempt such a flight alone, and so the flamboyant ace and the calm navigator were brought together. One man was appetite and spectacle. The other was discipline and routine finding. It was either an ideal combination or the setup for a very expensive obituary. The prize they sought was the Orteig Prize, offered in 1919 by New York hotel owner Raymond Orteig. $25,000 to the first aviators who could make a nonstop flight between New York and Paris. At first, nobody won it because aviation technology was still too immature and the Atlantic was still too good at killing confidence and people. But by 1924, when the offer was reviewed, the race became serious. Aircrafts were improving and pilots were getting bolder and better. And the route itself took on the gleam of a modern holy grail. Most Americans hoped to fly from New York to Paris, aided by prevailing winds. Some French aviators, including Charles and François, chose to do it the harder way, from Paris to New York. That meant flying against the prevailing weather pattern, which is exactly the sort of choice that makes later historians mutter into their notes regarding this story in particular. Their airplane was the Lavoisier PL-8, specially modified for this flight. It was based on a naval aircraft designed and strengthened for the transatlantic attempt. It carried more than 4,000 liters of fuel, which meant that it was loaded like a flying argument against moderation. The cockpit was widened so that Charles and François could sit side by side. The undercarriage could be jettisoned after takeoff, and this was to reduce weight. The fuselage underside was shaped to behave like a boat in case they needed to ditch on water. Their plan, wonderfully romantic and mildly terrifying, was to reach New York and land on the water near the Statue of Liberty. No radio was installed, of course. That detail alone should make you sit up a little bit straighter. If something went wrong, there would be no call for help. There would be no broadcast, no "we are descending now" message. There would be just absence and silence. The airplane itself was painted white, which made it instantly memorable and gave it the name. On the fuselage was Charles' old war insignia, that black heart with the skull and coffin. So even in peacetime, even on a machine built for a record, not for a dogfight, the White Bird still carried a grin from the grave. There was something strangely fitting about that. The aircraft looked clean and noble from a distance, but up close, it still wore a symbol that practically announced, "We are aware this could go badly." Testing went reasonably well. The engine had been run for more than 40 hours at the factory to prove that it could last the journey. The aircraft performed successfully enough to encourage confidence, though not with a full fuel load. That matters because every transatlantic attempt lives in the shadow of its own weight. The more fuel you carry, the farther you can go. The more fuel you carry, the harder it is to get off the ground. This is why so many pioneering flights began with some variation of the sentence, "The aircraft barely cleared the trees." And that is exactly what happened on May 8th. They took off from Le Bourget at 5:17 a.m. The weight of the White Bird was around 5,000 kilograms at takeoff, which was an alarming amount for a single-engine aircraft. It struggled into the air and barely missed the line of trees beyond the field. That was the first sign that this would not be a leisurely cruise across the friendly skies. Once airborne, they followed the planned route, turned back briefly, and jettisoned the undercarriage to save weight. From there, they headed out over the channel, observed and escorted by French aircraft before continuing alone. For a while, there were sightings. They were seen from the French coast. A British submarine officer noted a white biplane overhead. In Ireland, a few witnesses reported the aircraft passing above. Each of those sightings must have felt like a thread being stretched westward, a reassurance that the flight was real and on course, and that someone over the ocean, somewhere, there were two men still moving toward glory. But then the thread snapped. There were no more verified sightings that came for quite some time. And yet in New York, the mood swelled with anticipation. Crowds gathered at Battery Park to watch for the aircraft. People looked toward the Statue of Liberty, where the White Bird was supposed to arrive. You can picture this atmosphere. It's 1937. The hats are tilted back. The necks are craned. The newspapers are folded under the arms. There's excitement turning by slow degrees of impatience. Across the Atlantic in France, some newspapers, in a truly reckless display of patriotic wishfulness, reported that Charles and François had reached New York safely already. They didn't print this as rumored or possibility, but as safely, as a fact, with descriptions of festivities and triumph, and the country erupted in pride. But then came one of the cruelest twists in aviation history. All of those reports were false. For a little while, France celebrated a victory that had not happened. Families rejoiced. Readers imagined the heroes arriving over New York water, proving French aviation was supreme. And because the false reports created the impression that the French had already achieved this feat, they also stirred anti-American resentment when some believed their triumph was being denied or minimized. So think about that for a moment. Well, Charles and Francois were almost certainly already lost. Their names were being used in a phantom celebration, followed by public anger before the facts had even settled. Their absence became political before it even became fully understood. As the hours passed, hope began to dry out. The White Bird had carried enough fuel for roughly 42 hours of flight. Once that window closed without word, everyone had to confront what that meant. If they had not landed, they had to come down somewhere. The ocean seemed the obvious answer, of course. Maybe a squall or bad weather, icing, exhaustion, fuel miscalculation, navigational drift, engine failure. Maybe some combination of those grim classics could have brought them down in the Atlantic. And yet, the problem with the obvious answers is that they were not always satisfying, especially when witnesses refused to cooperate with the simplicity. Because soon there were claims from Newfoundland and Maine. Witnesses in Newfoundland reported a white aircraft circling in haze late on May 9th. Fishermen recalled cold, foul weather that could have slowed the flight. Residents in eastern Maine later insisted they had heard an airplane overhead or heard a crash in the distance. A hermit named Anson Berry became one of the most famous of these witnesses, saying he heard a sputtering aircraft pass over his camp near Round Lake in Maine, and then heard what sounded like a crash or a forced landing. He searched, but found nothing, and carried the story for years. Others added memories. Hunters, trappers, fishermen, rural residents, they remembered strange sounds, maybe a white aircraft, and rumors of wreckage. But this is where the story becomes truly maddening. Because unlike some myths that survive on nothing but wishful fog, the White Bird mystery has always had just enough substance to remain irritating. Pieces of wood, bits of metal, stories of a large engine dragged from the woods, claims that aircraft wreckage was found in the water, reports of a wing in Lost Island Sound. A later French official inquiry concluded saying that it was possible that the aircraft had reached Newfoundland. Not proven, but possible. That one word has kept the case alive for decades. Possible is a dangerous word for historians because it never lets a story sit down quietly. It never lets it go away. There were even wilder rumors. There were some that the aviators had been shot down by rum runners, that they had survived and were living among indigenous communities in Canada, that their engine had been discovered in Maine, that they had crashed off the Canadian coast after nearly reaching New York. Every few years, the mystery seemed to cough up one more theory, like a stage magician pulling handkerchiefs from an endless sleeve. Clive Cussler and his organization searched for clues. Television programs dramatized this case. Search teams combed lakes, forests, and coastal waters. Nothing conclusive ever turned up, not even to the end of the discussion. Not enough to close the file, just enough to keep it breathing. And then, because history occasionally behaves like it has no bedside manners at all, 12 days 12 days after François and Charles vanished, Charles Lindbergh took off from New York in the spirit of St. Louis. He flew solo to Paris and made it. He landed to one of the most famous heroes' welcomes in modern history. Paris, of course, went wild for him. France cheered him even while still grieving its own missing men. It's hard not to feel the sting of that juxtaposition. The French pair disappeared trying to be first. They were heroes they lost. Then an American arrives and becomes immortal. If Charles and Francois had reached New York first, even by a few hours, aviation memory might look very different today. Instead, they became the nearly first, which is one of those lonely places history can put you. That does not mean they were forgotten. Streets in France were named after them. Lakes in Canada bear their names. Their flight remained a part of aviation folklore. Their white bird is a symbol of audacity and loss. Films and books revisited the mystery, and children's television even turned their restless spirits into characters. But remembrance is not the same as victory. Lindbergh became the name that everyone knows. Charles and François became the question everyone argues over. That's a very different kind of legacy. And perhaps that's why their story continues to grip people more so than their achievements. A completed flight gives you a date, a route, applause, and a medal. A disappearance gives you weather, witness statements, rumors, arguments, maps, longing, and that awful ache of almost. Charles and Francois were not amateurs. These two men were not fools. They were experienced, decorated, and deeply serious about the task. They built a machine for the crossing. They planned their route. They took the harder direction. They may have come astonishingly close. And then they vanished so completely that the final stretch of their flight became not an ending, but a permanent wound in the story of aviation. I think there's also something deeply human in the contrast between the two men themselves. Charles, battered and brilliant, he was a peacock with scars. Francois was disciplined and steady, the man who knew how to find his way by stars and sea logic. Together, they formed a kind of symbolic bridge between old heroism and modern flight. One carried the swagger of wartime celebrity. The other carried the patient intelligence that keeps daring from becoming pure stupidity. If they did die in fog or weather or exhaustion, they did not die because they were reckless in the simple sense. They died trying to force the future to arrive 12 days early. And maybe that's the saddest detail of all. Their aircraft was called the White Bird, a name that sounds almost too delicate for the brutality of what likely happened. The birds are supposed to arrive somewhere. They migrate, they land, perch, and return. This one simply left. It became not a symbol of flight completed, but of flight interrupted, lost somewhere between two continents, between headlines, between one nation's hope and another nation's hero. So when people ask why the story still matters, I think the answer is easy. It matters because it reminds us that history is not always written by the most daring. Sometimes it's written by the survivors, the arrivals, the people who made it to the crowd. The missing live on differently. They become speculation, reverence, argument, and unfinished sentences. And yet there's something noble in that too. Charles and Francois did not disappear because they hesitated. They disappeared because they went on purpose. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I really would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If the Whitebird truly did reach North America before crashing, but no one could prove it, would you consider Charles and Francois the real first transatlantic winners, or does history only belong to the people who arrive where the world can see them, who arrive to the crowds? And of course, as always, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you follow the History Happens Facebook page for more deep dives into history's most fascinating moments. And subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Every subscriber helps. Thank you for watching.